Iron Queen by Derek Berry. Chapter 1. Scene 1. Keep your point up, Highness, barked Lieutenant Betrel, armsman to the Hive Queen in waiting. Good. Now, deeper on the cross step. Yes, that's it. Keep your sword pointed at me, steady as the rocks below. In point of fact, the rocks were far below, as Alisaria, heir to the throne, was practicing her footwork on a broad silk ribbon bridge, stretched between two branches, 50 feet above the ground. Her barbed chitinous legs burning, wings stretched for balance, and spiracles covered by armor, the princess was miserable. 5 turns of the minute glassed down, and she poured sweat, turning round her implacable taskmaster. It felt like she'd been at this for hours. What was footwork to one with wings? A question never uttered in the presence of Betrel. Queen to be or not, he might clip hers just to prove a point. Soul of courtesy he may be, yet he would brook no argument on the method and practice of the sword. Her mother would not punish his action either. For as she would say, one does not chastise the finger for pointing the way. No, Alisaria must suffer in silence. Keep your eyes on his head. Step, cross, step, cross, step. Halt, Betrel called. Tank mercy. She thought as her wings fluttered, lifting her to the branch where she could rest. Water splashed on her from above. Not a fat raindrop. No downpour could pierce the thick canopy of the hive tree. Alisaria glared upwards at her sister, Calida, smiling as she held one of the hollowed acorns the servants used to draw water. I couldn't have you attending my send-off without a proper bath, she called sweetly. Cruelty and anger filling her, Alisaria shouted back. One as clumsy as you. A colony queen. You can't even keep from falling into bed with the stable hand. Who would trust you with a crown? Perhaps that's why Mother is sending you away. I haven't heard any news from the other colonies. Maybe she wants you eaten, out in the wilds. Jealousy ill becomes you, sister. Imagine Crown Princess of Hive City, envious of a mere provincial queen. Like myself, came Calida with her saucy rejoinder. Better a provincial, building a new home, than a brood mare, chained to this warren, and you know it. Her reply a bitter gall. Perhaps, but such is the fate of royalty, sister. There is no higher calling, said Calida in a consoling tone. She's right, Highness, Betrel broke in. I know you have a heart to wander, but the hive cannot live without its queen. Your lady mother would be heartbroken to hear you speak so dismally of the throne. Chastised and depressed, Alisaria made her excuses, no longer caring for her lessons. Ever dramatic, she did her best to affect trudging forlornly while flying, thinking to herself, "'S fair." Scene 2. Elmsira had 12 true daughters. Female children capable of reproducing, a rare blessing. Custom holds within the people, but one queen may inherit. Traditionally other true females were granted charter, sallying forth establishing new hives elsewhere. To most, this would seem a mandate for growth and prosperity, yet to the reigning queen of Hive City, this seemed a death sentence. Not one of her 4 sisters had lived to establish a colony. How could she allow her children to suffer so? The mere thought of losing one of her precious babies left her breathless, paralyzed by crippling pain and the weight of dread. No, she could not let them go. The old stories of the exile, long dismissed by the rational and somewhat insular Pixie Society, told of pacts, necromancy, hexes, gesh, and the mark of living death. The mark in particular, A blood charm to place a person under the sway of the Maker seemed the answer to her prayers. She'd never believed, until one fateful day a wandering seeress proved to her the reality of the claims. In her desperation, it seemed the only answer. She could keep her children safe, protected, under the mark, away from the dangers lurking in the outer world. In this, her toss of the bones had proven quite fruitful. 10 of her children had been quietly sequestered within her harem, safe and tended by her chosen males. The time had come again. Khalida, her 11th child, walked with her after the ceremony of sending. Mischievous, scandalous Khalida, her beautiful daughter. Looking at her, she bloomed with feminine excess, her curves exaggerated in comparison to her siblings. Her beauty could not even be marred by the thickened abdomen of one who had been such a free spirit. So like my poor sister. Jael, thought the queen. Outwardly she said, "It would be wrong of me, my daughter, to send you into the world with less than adequate companionship. Come, we shall go to my chambers. You shall have your pick of my strong men to attend you on your journey." "My lady mother is most generous, thank you," Khalida replied, her normally mischievous manner hidden under the weight of impending responsibility. "Not at all, dear. I couldn't bear it if something were to happen to you," the queen replied in a voice choked with all too real fear and pain. Khalida, sensing the emotions, leaned upon her mother, lending her what comfort she could. They stayed thus, walking in companionable silence until they reached the harem chambers of the queen. The queen bade her daughter to recline upon the elegant silver-gilt divan. Elmsira, ringing a small bell of matching finery, summoned her males. They emerged from the doors hidden amongst the shadowed drapery. The men, bound by the powerful sexual essences of the queen, stood ready to do as instructed. Nodding her assent, the lead man crossed to his mistress, while 4 bull-necked brutes grasped Khalida, lifting her splayed by wrist and ankle. Bowing, the lead man, Tibble, father of Khalida, drew the ritual dagger from the girdle of his loincloth. With stoic slowness, he drew the blade across his throat, cutting through the unhardened chitin and bringing forth his life's blood. Dropping to his knees, he presented the blade to his love. Hands trembling, Elmsira took up the fell dagger and proceeded to carve upon the forehead of her daughter the likeness of a skull. As she did this, she kept up a rhythmic crooning, the words of the spell chant long lost, leaving her to pour the sum of her fear, love, weakness, and will into the form. As she neared completion of the ritual, she slashed her own palm, smearing her blood across the mark she had carved, ending her chant with a single word invested with a multitude of rasping voices: "Bind." Abruptly, Tibble, her faithful companion, fell dead, his life consumed even as the mark on Khalida's head turned the white of bleached bone, and her eyes dimmed as the eyes of a corpse. Overcome with grief, Elmsira collapsed, her breath ragged, tearing away her blood-stained gown, and lay as one in a fit, twitching in time with the waves of sorrow. She lay this way for an unknowable time, until a hand lay upon her and in a distant childlike voice, her Khalida spoke, "Don't cry, mother. I love you." Scene 3. There were times, all too frequent times, when Betrel felt inadequate for his position. Make no mistake, he knew what he was about when it came to his arms and matters of duty. However, his charge required more of him than merely a guard or tutor. His charge was in sore need of discipline and fatherly wisdom, and he, a mere 4 years her elder, had no desire to take that burden. Her own father had died while she was still young, lost to a sparrow attack while out hunting. After such a loss, no mere servant could offer what she needed to mature. Now, 16 years later, Betrel was left with a lazy, petulant brat he must guard and guide, to assume the mantle of matriarch. It seemed an impossible task. He was no mentor, and had only the scant authority afforded to him by the Queen. Perhaps he should seek reassignment. After all, he'd only been Alisaria's ombudsman for 3 years, longer than the other 5 previous, but still, a grizzled no-nonsense sergeant, like the ones who trained him, would be a far better fit for this. Perhaps, sounded a familiar, gravelly voice in his head, but can you admit defeat so easily? Damn it, Sergeant Barret, then how would you handle this? Betrel thought angrily. Then, in an underwhelming realization of his own obtuseness, I should go ask him. The gruff old training sergeant should be coming off duty soon. He wouldn't solve your problems, but if you put up with the abuse, he'd point you in the right direction. Betrel flew down to the marshalling field Barret called his, only to find it bare. Not a conscript in sight. The barracks too were empty. Finally he came to a soldier on watch asking, "Excuse me, Corporal, but where might I find the training sergeant?" "So," the corporal replied professionally, "the sergeant is on a field exercise 5 miles to the southeast. The pennants should be set, and fires lit by the time you arrive. Would you like me to arrange a guide to escort you?" Waving the offer away, Betrel replied, "That won't be necessary. I know where the old man likes to camp." "Thank you, Corporal." Buzzing low over the field of waving grain stalks surrounding Hive Tree, eyes sharp, Betrel made his way to the southeastern clearing Barret favoured. When 6 inches tall is a fine specimen of manhood, the common pests larger folk took for granted became dangers fit to challenge a squad of elite pixie lancers. Vigilance is therefore essential when travelling any distance from the hive. So, in spotting a pair of well-muscled, hooded men, carrying a burden wrapped in silk between them, the young lieutenant felt compelled to investigate. Grabbing hold of one of the nearby stalks, he ceased the flutter of his wings and slid down. Drawing his sword and buckler, he stalked forward through the green shoots. Following in their blind spot for 10 minutes, he heard the shorter of the two exclaim, "Right, this should be far enough. Let's get digging." Suiting action to word, the man set down his side of the burden, pulled a hinged shovel from a large bag at his waist, and proceeded to mark the edges of a traditional pixie grave. His partner followed suit, setting his side of the burden down with care, and began digging within the bounds set. This didn't make sense. The hive had criminals, of course, but criminals didn't give the bodies they left respectful burials, and honest men would bury a man in the graveyard, with a marker so all would know the name of the redeemed. Neither man carried a weapon longer than their short shovels. It was this observation which resolved him to impose. With the textbook impulsive bravery of all junior officers, he stepped forward calling out a challenge. "In the name of the Queen, I command you to halt and explain your actions." Starting and cursing, the 2 men took one look at the officer in his dress armor of gilded leather, and attacked. The larger of the two swung his shovel like an axe, while the shorter rose on buzzing wings drawing a stout poniard in reverse grip. Parrying the stroke of the shovel, Betrel thrust upward impaling the dagger man, only to have his sword stripped from his hand, as the man fell to the dark earth. Cursing under his breath, Betrel drew the ornamental carp-tongued dagger from its place on his belt. The thin blade was ill-suited for heavy use, so he was forced to rely on his buckler, parrying the powerful strikes as he saw an opening. Finding it, he plunged the dagger, hilt deep into the ribs of the man. Hearing a snap, he withdrew his blade only to find its tip broken off inside. Throwing the weapon away in disgust, he collected his sword and the dagger of the shorter man, searching the body for anything to identify the two. Finding the sheath, he took a step back in shock. The collar around the mouth of the sheath was stamped with the house crest marking its owner, as in a family of the Queen. It couldn't be. He had to see who was in the wrappings. Taking up the dagger, he cut away the fine silk, revealing a face he knew well. He'd seen it just last night, with his daughter, Calida. Tibble was dead, and men from the Queen's harem had borne him here, to be buried in an unmarked grave. Scene 4. Heedless now of danger, Betrol flew with reckless speed, the hum of his wings loud amidst the otherwise still, early evening. Spotting sentries patrolling the air, he veered towards them, slowing only when close enough to hail the nearest pair. "I am Lieutenant Betrol of the Queen's Guard. Summon the training sergeant. I must speak with him." Flinching, one dove to obey, while the other kept to his post, as was protocol. To the young man's credit, he did not fidget as he hovered under the fearsome gaze of the officer. The only sign of tension revealed in the slight relaxation of his posture as Sergeant Barre dismissed him to return to his patrol. The sergeant took one look at the evidently disturbed lieutenant and said, "Come with me, lad." Stopping only to requisition a field spade from the camp quartermaster, the sergeant led his former pupil into the weeds, navigating them away from camp. Once out of earshot, he began in a world-weary voice, "You don't need to tell me what you saw. Calida's sending was last night. Tibble was a good man, loved Elmsira too much. You know the gods say, I make camp here because it's where I bury the recruits who truly foul up. They tell the conscripts, I enjoy the perversity of having them sleep on a grave." Like most barracks rumors, he grunted, digging at the dirt. "There's some truth deep under the shit. The person buried here is me, Sergeant?" asked Betrol, confused as he heard the clunk of metal on wood. "Help me pull this up, lad. The answers you want are here," Sergeant Barre ordered as he hauled on a sealed wooden box. Acting on instinct at the sergeant's stone, Betrol grabbed the other end, and the two pulled up the weathered trunk from its resting place. Inside were 3 items: a harness of armadillo plate armor, a short bronze spear of an cruel exotic design, and a dagger, matching the blade shoved in his own belt. "You were in a family," Betrol gasped. "I'm Alisaria's father," confirmed Barre. Why did you leave? If you're at Chessa, how has the Queen not recognized you?" Chessa, the man who called himself Barre, responded, "I left to protect my daughter, Elmsira. The love of my life is broken. The pain of her sister's loss and the fear for her own children drove her mad. She can't let go. If I remained, then Alisaria would be a slave, like her sisters. She slew my fellows, her mates, used their lifeblood to bind the poor girls to her will. Elmsira can't let go. How could she? The Queen, she killed Tibble. And Calida, a slave. The Queen is a shade of her former self. The magic she called on out of desperate love and pain hollowed her. She cannot, let go, because she is dead. The glamour granted by her pact fools even her, but in truth it's her children who now sustain the hive. She is a hollow," spoke Chessa. "How can you be sure?" Betrol asked. "You've been hiding on the periphery of the guard, after disappearing for years." "I know, because I witnessed the beginning, and sought the counsel of shaman and sorcerers in my wanderings. Now enough questions, lad. Strip that bloody harness. Give me your sword and kit," commanded Cheshire, falling back into the role of sergeant. Petrel, overwhelmed, complied in the manner of a seasoned trooper, placing his garb and weapons in a neat pile. Cheshire then handed him the harness of plates, followed by the spear and dagger. "Put those on, lad," he urged. "You can't return to the city. When the Queen finds her men missing, she'll track the blood you spilt and find these rags." Gesturing to the stained dress armor, "I'll bury them in this box and arrange for a training mission to find the bodies on patrol in a few days. By the time word reaches the Queen, you will be long away." "Where will I go?" asked Petrel. "Make your way to the village of Kerod, in the Highlands. A friend from my time in exile can be found there. His name is Teruk. He's a mercenary of the Scaled Folk. He'll know you by my harness and welcome you into his host. Now go, lad, while the night shelters you." Scene 5. Cheshire, alone now, had much to prepare. He hadn't told Petrel the whole truth. The lad couldn't outrun the reach of the Queen if she thought he lived. His armor was going in the ground, but not in Cheese's old trunk. No. After a suitable level of savaging with his knife and a dip in some rat droppings, it was going into a nearby warren. After fighting for every step, the guards and by extension the Queen would be more inclined to believe their quarry was dead. He'd never been more thankful for the sleeping powder recipe gifted to him by the Pyrian Whisper. It had saved 2 lives tonight. Godspeed, lad. Godspeed. Scene 6. Elmsira sat amongst her children weeping the loss of her Tibble. Grief still fresh on her heart, she couldn't rouse herself from the comforting presence of her daughters. As her Khalida stroked the wiry antennae growing, like a living cloud, round her head, she mourned. To any who saw her now, she would appear as she truly was, her carapace the shed skin of a cicada, only the eyes, to burning coals showing the awareness in her hollow shell. Yet none but her charmed family were there to see, and their eyes were as clouded as those of their mad mother. This was the way of things. She would recover. The void would howl less fiercely, but for now, the price must be paid. A knocking at the door shattered her near catatonic state, and as she had in life, she straightened her appearance, the glamour falling back in place. Burying her pain, she called, "Come in." Sandral, a kind man, who'd given her no children in his 5 years as a member of the harem, came through the door, kneeled before her and said, "My queen, the guards have discovered Zek and Shevan with Tibble's body. They believe all 3 to have been murdered." Fresh pain and anger set the howling of the void inside her to intolerable levels. She growled with rage, "Have their bodies brought to me and set the guard to hunt this killer. No quarter is to be offered. No surrender accepted. Kill them." We hope you have enjoyed this, the first chapter of Iron Queen, Book 1 of the DRI Chronicles. The full audiobook is in production, so stay tuned for more sword